You already know the deadliest shipwreck in history. At least you think you do. When most people picture a ship going down, they picture the Titanic. Around 1,500 lives lost. A tragedy the whole world still remembers. But on a freezing night in January 1945, a different ship went down in the Baltic Sea, and it took nearly 9,000 people with it, 6 times the death toll of the Titanic. Most of them were women and children, and almost no one has ever heard its name. This is the story of the Wilhelm Gustloff and the reason history buried it. But to understand how one ship swallowed 9,000 people in a single hour, you have to go back to a time when she was the safest place imaginable. Because when she launched in 1937, the Wilhelm Gustloff was not a warship at all. She was a holiday cruise liner built to carry ordinary German workers out to sea. She was named after a Nazi party official who had been assassinated a year earlier. She was the proud flagship of a state program that sold the new regime as the good life. For a few years, she sailed the coasts as a floating postcard. Then the war came, and the postcard turned gray. She was stripped of her bright paint and handed over to the Navy. By the winter of 1945, she had spent years tied up as a floating barracks, going nowhere. But far to the east, something was moving that would put her back to sea one last time, because as the Red Army advanced, millions of civilians in East Prussia were fleeing for their lives. They had heard the stories of what was coming, and they ran toward the sea. Their only way out was by ship, in a huge evacuation called Operation Hannibal. Before it ended, it would move around 2 million people, far more than Dunkirk, and so the idle liner and the fleeing millions were about to collide into one story. On January 30th, the Wilhelm Gustloff became one of the ships sent to carry them out. People surged aboard, clutching children, suitcases, anything they could carry. The ship had been designed to carry around 1,500 people in comfort. By the time they stopped writing down names, almost 8,000 were aboard. And then thousands more pushed on after the counting simply stopped. The best estimates put more than 10,000 human beings on that ship. Nearly 9,000 of them were civilians. Many of them were children. On the afternoon of the 30th, dangerously overloaded, she set out into the open Baltic. The water that night sat near freezing. The air above it was colder still. Inside, the press of thousands of bodies made the ship stifling and humid. So many passengers took off their life jackets, or never put them on at all. For a few hours, the crossing was quiet, far too quiet. But up on the bridge, the men in charge could not agree on how to keep her safe. 4 captains shared command that night, and they argued over the route. One begged to hug the shallow coast and run dark, where submarines could not easily follow. Instead, the senior captain chose deeper water, swept clear of mines. Then a radio message warned of a German minesweeper convoy coming the other way. To avoid a collision in the dark, the captain switched on the ship's navigation lights. In the middle of a war zone, the most crowded ship in the world lit herself up. The convoy never came. There may never have been one at all, because beneath that black water, something had already seen those lights. The Soviet submarine S-13 had spent days prowling the Baltic for a target. Her captain, Alexander Marinesko, was a man with everything to prove. He was facing a court-martial back home, his career hanging by a thread. And then, through the dark, he saw her, a giant, lit up against the snow. Marinesko made a bold gamble. He slipped his submarine in between the Gustloff and the shore. An attack from the coast was the last thing anyone would expect. At 16 minutes past 9, he gave the order to fire. 3 torpedoes tore across the water and struck the ship along her port side. The first hit the bow, and heavy watertight doors slammed shut automatically, sealing dozens of off-duty crew inside before they could ever escape. The second struck a section deep in the ship, where hundreds of young women were housed in a drained swimming pool. Almost none of them got out. The third hit the engine room, and in a heartbeat, the ship went dark and silent. No power, no engines, no clear way to call for help. And 10,000 people, in the dark, felt the floor begin to tilt beneath them. What happened next was not an orderly evacuation. It was a stampede. Then came the next horror. Many of the lifeboats were simply gone, taken for the war. The ones that remained were frozen solid to the ship in the brutal cold. Crews hacked at the ice to free them, and only a handful ever reached the water. With the ship dying under them, people jumped into the freezing Baltic. In water that cold, a human body has only minutes. Many who jumped were pulled under or simply froze where they floated. And in the few boats that made it out, a terrible math took hold. Some survivors later said the boats had to turn swimmers away to keep from capsizing, leaving them to the sea. The Wilhelm Gustloff took only about 1 hour to die. Within 60 minutes, the deadliest shipwreck in history was gone beneath the Baltic. Other German ships raced in and pulled survivors from the water through the night, but the cold had done its work. Out of more than 10,000, only around 1,200 lived. One of the last people pulled alive from the sea was a baby, found wrapped against the cold. So here is the question that haunts this story. Why have you never heard of it? Part of the answer is brutal timing. The war in Europe had only months left to run. And this was Germany, the nation that had started the war and caused immense suffering. In the shadow of that history, the wider world had little room to mourn German dead. On the other side, the Soviets stayed silent too. Their man Marinesko was in disgrace, so they never celebrated his deadliest strike. He was only named a hero of his country in 1990, long after his death. And so the largest loss of life at sea in human history was quietly filed away. For decades, the survivors carried it in silence, their grief tangled up with their nation's guilt. Many never spoke of the night the sea took everything, not even to their own children. It took a German novelist more than 50 years later to finally drag the story back into the light, and when he did, most of his readers had never even heard the name Wilhelm Gustloff. Today the wreck still lies on the floor of the Baltic, marked on the charts as a war grave. Nearly 9,000 people, most of them civilians, most of them never even named. By some counts, close to 5,000 of the dead were children, 6 times the Titanic, with almost no monument, no famous film, no place in the world's memory. The Titanic is remembered because the world chose to remember it. The Gustloff is the opposite. It shows that history does not measure the dead by how many they were, but by who is left to mourn them. History is full of these buried numbers, and some of them were buried on purpose. Next time, the disaster so strange and so embarrassing that an entire town agreed never to speak of it again. Subscribe, and you will hear it.